I've heard from people who work in hiring and deal with employment issues in both the private and public sectors. They're telling me that the media keeps blowing it on what Trump has been doing. They say if you look at the headlines and so much of the coverage, you wouldn't realize what he has done and not done, and what a president even can do. And they're right. This coverage has been very misleading. It often is when it comes to these kinds of issues. I know this from experience, not just as a journalist, but also on the other side, as someone covered by the media. I had a legal case involving discrimination that put me on the front page of the New York Times and in lots of big media. Actually, coming up, I'll play you a clip from the Today Show where they were discussing my case. Throughout that time, I saw clearly how much the media needs handholding when it comes to what employment laws are. This gets at a big problem in our society. Workers are not empowered with knowledge about their rights. So it's no surprise that people who do news stories don't know this stuff either. Today, your rights as a worker, and the media is missing a big story related to all this. Trump's moves on gender and trans people put him up against his own Supreme Court pick, someone who he called the very best judge in the country. He is basically in a face-off against this justice who he cannot fire. How is the media not covering this? I'll explain. Plus, the Washington Post gets sneaky using a movie review to lie and rewrite history. Man, that paper is a disaster. All that is coming up today on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. I'm Josh Lebs, and this is my podcast, They Stand Corrected, which fact-checks the news. This is usually the part in which I tell you that I spent 20 years on mainstream media, 10 on NPR and 10 on CNN, and during that time I saw all these systemic problems that prevent these big mainstream news organizations from doing their job and getting you the truth. But today I'm going to also tell you about something else. I had a legal case that caused this kind of switcheroo in my life, where I went from being someone doing news stories to being someone covered by the media. Here is a little clip from NBC's Today Show when that happened.
Another story that's got a lot of people talking this morning. CNN reporter Josh Lebs has filed a gender discrimination claim with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission against his employer. He wants the same 10 weeks of paid leave that CNN's mothers get. Mm-hmm. Birth mothers get 10 weeks paid leave, and the same policy applies both men and women who adopt or have children through a surrogate. So in other words, if you adopt in your dad, you do get the 10 weeks, but not if you're biological father.
You only get
You get 2 weeks.
Hosts Al Roker and Willie Geist expressed their support, which I appreciated. My case ended up getting a lot of traction, a lot of publicity. I was on the front page of the business section of the New York Times, and then later on the front page of the paper. All these media talking about it. And I was getting all this support from people across the political spectrum, from men and women, from moms groups and women's groups, mom blogs and dad blogs. Prominent people who work for gender equality, like Sheryl Sandberg and Maria Shriver. Actually, Maria and I wrote a piece together for the Huffington Post. Anyway, I wrote a book in which I dig into all this stuff. And in that process, I learned a lot about employment and employment laws and why my case became so interesting to so many people. My book was called All In, and the short version here is that if men cannot be equal caregivers, women cannot get equal opportunities in the workplace. Actually, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a pioneer in understanding this. The first time she appeared before the Supreme Court as a lawyer arguing a case, it was on behalf of a father. She understood, as have a lot of people who care about real equality, that gender equality is for everyone. Anyway, this episode is not about my case. In the process, I discovered that so many people inside news agencies don't know what the laws are. I was able to explain in language that makes sense and does not get lost in legalese. That is relevant now because what we're seeing in the coverage of Trump is a lot of confusion in the media about what employment laws are. You've probably heard that he's canceling DEI programs, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, specific programs inside the federal government designed to focus on those issues. And there's more that he's doing. Here is a segment from MSNBC.
With a stroke of the pen, President Trump signed an executive order erasing a touchdown of the civil rights era. He canceled a landmark executive order banning discrimination in the federal workplace. It was signed by President Lyndon Johnson back in 1965. For the past 60 years, it ensured equal opportunity in federal hiring by banning discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin.
If you saw or heard that segment, you wouldn't realize what he's actually doing. That is not alone. Here are some headlines. As I've mentioned on this show, way more people see headlines than see news stories. So keep that in mind as I read you these. Here's one from CNN. Trump rescinds measure used to fight workplace discrimination for 60 years. Here's one from CBS. Trump doesn't only want to end DEI, he's also voiding a civil rights era anti-discrimination rule. And a column from the Washington Post from this writer, Petula Dvorak, has this headline and subheadline.
Trump isn't the first to upend the federal workforce because of race. President Woodrow Wilson presided over the segregation of government workers, putting Black people behind screens and in cages in 1913.
Holy Lord! Now, these are all examples of things that are technically true, but still leave you in the dark as to what's going on. And to be clear, this has nothing to do with defending any decisions that Trump is making. It's about leaving you unaware of what Trump is doing and what any president can do and what legal protections you have from discrimination, no matter who you are, no matter what body you're born into. Everyone, every person has certain legal protections. And you would think from this that they're gone. It's especially confusing when you hear references to civil rights era rules because there's more than one. And the big one, the main one, the one that has made by far the biggest difference remains firmly in place. Under our system, a president cannot erase it. To understand that, we need to take a trip back to 1964.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago. 5 hours after the House passes the measure, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed at the White House by President Johnson.
Here's a piece of what he said that day.
This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country.
As you probably know, when acts make it through Congress, they often end up with a lot of text and measures in them. And sometimes they have these sections called titles. One of the titles of the Civil Rights Act was number 7, Title 7. Which made it illegal to discriminate based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Those of us who were born well after the Civil Rights Act grew up in a world in which this was just the case. So we might take the concept for granted. But if you look back at American history, you see that employers were openly saying to only apply for jobs if you were a white Christian male. Excluding people from work was normal. Credit where it's due, there was a good clip from MSNBC. This is Jill Wine-Banks, a former Watergate prosecutor.
When I graduated law school, I was interviewing for jobs and was asked questions like, what kind of birth control do you use? How many children are you going to have? Those were questions that were quite legal back then.
Trump cannot, with the stroke of a pen, get rid of the Civil Rights Act or any of its titles because it's a law which goes through the legislative branch. When I was little, we had Schoolhouse Rock about this. Sometimes I think the media should have to go back and watch these.
I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill.
That was so awesome. When you see or hear that Trump has gotten rid of a civil rights rule that Johnson signed, that's something else. Here's the deal. President Johnson also signed an executive order. I pulled up the language of it, and I'll post it in the newsletter so you can see it for yourself. As head of the executive branch, the president can make decisions about which companies can do business with the federal government, getting federal contracts. In that executive order, he said companies can only do business with the federal government if they make an active effort to ensure that they're not discriminating. He wanted them to be active about it. And the language he used for that became very significant because the order said these contractors must, quote, take affirmative action to ensure that equal opportunity is provided in all aspects of their employment. Of course, the term affirmative action grew to mean a lot more across our society and become controversial. Other presidents have kept that executive order in place. Trump has rescinded it. Another president could reinstate it or create a new one. That is within the purview of a president. But understand, it is illegal to discriminate on the basis of anyone being part of what's referred to as a protected class. If you have reason to believe that you have experienced this kind of discrimination, you can take legal action. Something you can do is file a claim through the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, known as the EEOC. That's what I did. At the time, there were all these news reports saying that I had filed a lawsuit. And at first, I tried to correct people and explain, well, it's this other legal maneuver, but that was like a runaway train. So many places were saying it that I couldn't keep after all of them. And I found that some people do use the term lawsuit to refer to things that aren't actually actions in courts. Anyway, if you experience discrimination for any of these reasons, so for being black or for being white or whatever, all that is illegal. Yes, it happens all the time anyway, but it would take an act of Congress to erase part of the Civil Rights Act, and that would be a huge undertaking. In case anyone is wondering, there are some states called right-to-work states that have fewer protections for workers than other states, but that's irrelevant for this. Everywhere in the country, it is illegal to discriminate based on those factors. That brings us to this. It takes a lot to surprise me when it comes to the media getting things wrong or missing stories, but they are missing this. President Trump is heading for a legal showdown against his Supreme Court pick. He's openly going after a legal decision that this justice wrote, and it's someone he can't fire. That is coming up.
Hi, this is Sarah from Atlanta. This show is exactly what we need at this moment in time. Josh is a passionate advocate for journalism, calls things as he sees them, and is actively working to reestablish the credibility of the profession. And we all know a strong and independent media is crucial for democracy to exist and flourish. They Stand Corrected truly focuses on facts and objective truth and does an amazing job of revealing the behind-the-curtain influences that can so easily blur them. This podcast is incredibly important, relevant, and I believe is already making a difference in newsrooms around the country.
Messages like this mean so much, especially when they come in the form of reviews for the show. Here's one from Apple Podcasts, which just blew me away. The only podcast I regularly must listen to. It helps me feel reassured that in a world that can feel chaotic and wild, there are people working very hard to advocate for truth and justice. I always leave feeling better informed and also motivated to be a part of the change that we need to help us all connect on the most fundamental levels. An absolute must listen for all. This is so humble brag when I read this stuff, but I have promised people that I will read them. And when you submit yours, I will read yours as well. This fuels me. It helps me keep going through all the hard work of putting together this podcast. Thank you. In addition to these other moves involving DEI and anti-discrimination policies, President Trump has also taken action involving transgender people. Here is one clip from CNN.
Here in Washington tonight, we are hearing from a major veterans group criticizing President Trump's ban on transgender troops from serving in the military. The CEO of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America says that the president's order tells service members their sacrifice is not valued.
And another one.
Trump signed an executive order declaring the U.S. only recognizes two genders.
Here's what so much of the media missed when these moves were announced. These actions pit Trump against his own first Supreme Court pick, Neil Gorsuch. In 2020, Gorsuch wrote the decision for the majority in a Supreme Court case that's referred to as Bostock. It was a 6-3 decision. Gorsuch wrote that you can't discriminate against trans people in employment. He cited Title VII, and he wrote, quote, "When an employer fires an employee for being homosexual or transgender, it necessarily intentionally discriminates against that individual in part because of sex." He also wrote, "An employer who fires an individual merely for being gay or transgender defies the law." To be fair, there are a few places in the news in which someone has mentioned this. I saw this interview on TV station KTVU. They interviewed Michelle Goodwin, who's a constitutional law professor at Georgetown. She was speaking about Trump's rule requiring everyone to identify as one of two genders in the federal workforce.
Clearly, this executive order is inconsistent with where the Supreme Court has even landed.
There was also a written story at the CBS website. It has the director of the Center for Constitutional Studies at the Cato Institute, which is a conservative think tank, Thomas Berry, saying that some parts of this will be controversial. He cited the Bostock ruling. He said he's curious to see how much Trump will push back against that. So this isn't just a story about the workplace and policies. It's also the kind of story that the media would usually get into, this inside Washington stuff, pitting Trump against another powerful individual. This is a time to look at what Trump said about Gorsuch when he announced him as his first Supreme Court pick back in 2017.
I made a promise to the American people. If I were elected president, I would find the very best judge in the country for the Supreme Court. I promised to select someone who respects our laws and is representative of our Constitution and who loves our Constitution, and someone who will interpret them as written.
Here's how he described Gorsuch.
He is the man of our country and a man who our country really needs and needs badly to ensure the rule of law and the rule of justice.
Trump has a long history of praising people until they do anything he doesn't like and then firing them and saying that they were actually so awful all along. He's also been using his political strength to get rid of lawmakers he doesn't like, convincing voters to turn on them. So while a president cannot fire lawmakers, he has been able to use his political power to get people to fire them. But a Supreme Court justice, he can't fire. By the way, his other two Supreme Court picks went with the minority in the Bostock case. But the fact that Gorsuch wrote the opinion shows his commitment to it. Now, some groups are launching a legal challenge to Trump's moves on gender, setting up a showdown that pits Trump against Gorsuch's ruling. One more thing on this. The whole idea of everyone falling into one of two genders is factually false. That's not an opinion. It doesn't even have to involve the concept of gender identity. It's just a fact. Not everyone is. Remember what happened with the Olympics? Some people who have female biology also have male traits, and there were lots of people arguing that they should not be considered females for sports. I discussed all this in episode 19. Not everyone has exclusively one gender just in terms of reproductive organs. And chromosomal makeup doesn't always determine it either. There are people who are not XX or XY, and there are people who have female reproductive organs but also XY chromosomes. These things happen. They're rare, but they happen. One term you might hear sometimes is intersex. So saying everyone is male or female is just false. The same people saying that for sports, you do not belong in one of these categories are now saying for federal work, you have to put yourself into one of these categories. Media point out the conflict between these two things. Coming up, the Washington Post tries to use a movie review to rewrite history. There's no end to the journalistic fiascos there. I have an event coming up that you can attend live wherever you are because it's a webinar. This one is for a group based at the University of Colorado. It's called Health Links. And we're talking about the challenges and opportunities for caregivers in this new era. This is something I've discussed on the show. I follow this closely and have my own experience that led me to understand what works for caregivers and organizations and our whole society. This is for people who do any kind of caregiving. You might care for children or an elderly parent or a spouse or another loved one. It's taking place on February 19th during the day. There's a sign-up link that you can find in my newsletter. On this show, as you might know, I try to avoid mentioning a lot of numbers. In broadcasting, using lots of numbers is pretty much useless. It's not the kind of thing that anybody's going to memorize. But in the newsletter, I do include some more data points. When you have them in front of you, so you can look at them and click on them to see sources, all that stuff can be very helpful. There is a great resource for this that you should know about. Steve Ballmer was CEO of Microsoft and is the owner of the Clippers. He took a look at what a mess government data is, and he talks about it in a video.
We have over 90,000 government jurisdictions in the United States. Assembling numbers from so many places.
He put together a resource. You can sign up for a weekly email that gives you a snapshot of the U.S. Really interesting angles, like which state has the most people volunteering, which city has the most homeless or unhoused people, which jobs in America are the fastest growing. It's a little snapshot that helps you understand our country better. To get this, make sure to use my unique link. Thanks to a paid partnership, if you use my link to sign up for that weekly email, then for a limited time, you'll be supporting They Stand Corrected. Thanks to USA Facts for making that happen. So to find the link, look at the show notes or my newsletter. Just click sign up and a little contribution will come to help support this show. Usually on this show, I take a macro look at problems with the media. I point to problems that are widespread across big national organizations. But sometimes it's super instructive to take a micro look, to put one story under the microscope. The more you zoom in, the more you find that these news agencies get sneaky in how they try to lie to you to advance their agendas. This is case in point. The Washington Post had what was ostensibly an article about a movie. This new movie is called September 5th, and it takes place against a backdrop of Palestinian terrorists slaughtering 11 Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics in 1972. Actually, when I was in Germany on a journalistic fellowship program, I took a trip over to that site. Anyway, this movie focuses on a news team covering those events. If you look at this recent Washington Post story with any knowledge of what happened, you immediately see one giant glaring hole in it. It's such a sign of how shameless the Post has become. Oh, if you haven't heard previous episodes, then you should know that I've discussed what a disaster the Post is now, and its coverage of the Middle East is largely run by former employees of the Qatari government. They were leaders of Qatar's state-owned propaganda operation, which is known around the world as Al Jazeera. Anyway, this was supposed to be an article about a movie, but of course it ran with the Post's backward agenda. For starters, it says the movie avoids any substantial discussion of Israeli-Palestinian relations.
A notable omission given that the film is being released as Israeli forces continue to bombard Gaza, where about 1.9 million people have been displaced over more than a year of brutal warfare.
You know what this article does not mention? The fact that Israelis are being held hostage and being killed by Palestinian terrorists now. If we were talking about any other topic, this obvious omission would be noticed. The movie is about Palestinian terrorists holding hostage and slaughtering Israeli civilians. Is there any current parallel for this? But this writer, her name is Sonia Rao, her piece literally does not mention that has been happening. It has one line about, quote, the Hamas attack on October 7th, 2023. It does not say what that was or anything about hostages. It gets worse. The article uses a sneaky trick to try to rewrite history. It has this reference.
The hostage crisis, which also led to the deaths of a German police officer and 5 members of Black September, the Palestinian militant organization demanding the freedom of political prisoners in Israeli custody.
That was a straight up lie. I wrote to the Post and corrected them, and I'm going to post the letter that I wrote in my newsletter so you all can share it and forward it and all that kind of stuff. Do you know what I cited in my letter? The Post's own reporting. All right, here's the deal. This article that you just heard that quote from says Black September was demanding the freedom of political prisoners in Israeli custody. But back in 1972, when the Post covered what actually happened, Here's what it said. At first, it had no problem referring to these folks repeatedly as terrorists, which they were, by definition. And it said this massacre, quote, was but one in a series of acts of terrorism by Arab guerrillas whose goal is to drive the Israelis out of the Middle East. Also, that 1972 story had a line about political prisoners with the word political in quotes. This is where the microscope comes in. It said this group, Black September, wanted to force Israel to release, quote, political, unquote, prisoners. This is a huge difference. That was the Post acknowledging that Black September was calling these folks political prisoners, not the Post itself saying that they were political prisoners. In reality, Black September wanted terrorists released, not just Palestinian terrorists. This group also demanded the release of 2 members of Germany's Red Army faction, the group that carried out bank robberies, arsons, and terrorist bombings. So, the Post is using this new article to pretend that this group of people at the time just wanted the release of political prisoners, something that the Post itself, back in 1972, made clear was not the case. Now, you might think, well, that initial reporting was decades ago. Maybe there's a new perspective now or something. Well, facts are facts. This group wanted the release of terrorists. But here's something else. That coverage, 1972, was the same year as the Watergate scandal. And the Post, to this day, points to its coverage of Watergate, calling it a sign of the Post's long history of journalistic standards and blah, blah. But when it comes to this, they ignore their own 1972 coverage in order to lie to you and yet again whitewash Islamist terrorism. I did an episode about Black September and how it actually got its name from a fight with Jordan. If you haven't heard that, I encourage you to check it out. It was episode 8. Here is a clip. In 1970, Palestinians hijacked a bunch of airplanes. There were 5 different planes involved. 2 were out of Tel Aviv, but the other 3 had nothing to do with Israel. Palestinians managed to achieve their goal with 3 of them, which was to land in Jordan. The hijackers wanted to make demands of Jordan. To some people, these memories are very much alive. After the October 7th terrorist attacks, one of the hostages from the 1970 hijackings wrote a piece in Newsweek about how it brought back her experiences. I'll include that in the newsletter. After the hijackers landed these planes in Jordan, the Jordanian military fought Palestinian groups.
King Hussein has appointed a select group of soldiers known as the Red Berets to spearhead attacks.
That is sound from ITV.
It's incredible the firepower that the Jordanian army must have had in Amman.
Jordan managed to push a lot of these Palestinian groups out of the country into Lebanon, which then led to warring later in Lebanon. No one knows the death toll from the Jordanian fighting with these groups. At the time, the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, claimed that 25,000 Palestinians were killed. But today, people who follow this closely don't believe that's true. That war became known as the Jordanian Civil War, or by another name, Black September. One more thing on this recent Washington Post piece. Ironically, this article about the new movie specifically discusses journalistic ethics.
It wasn't about who's right and who's wrong in this millennia-old conflict, he said. It was about how the media shares these stories with us. It's a study of journalism, a study of journalism ethics, a study of how we react in crises.
First of all, no, the movie does not involve a millennia-old conflict. Islam didn't even exist multiple millennia ago. And the Palestinian movement, the push for yet another Arab Muslim state as a cause célèbre of a global effort to destroy the tiny dot of a Jewish state, that is extremely recent history. The Post talking about journalistic ethics while violating journalistic ethics, that might deserve a new Media Fail Award. And that's it for today. As always, I want to hear what you think. There are 2 great ways to get in touch with me. Anyone can use a form at my website. It's this really cool form that gets directly to me. You'll find it at joshlevs.com. Also, a great way to support this show is to become a paid subscriber at the newsletter. If you do that, you get exclusive content. I have some very cool stuff coming just for paid subscribers. And only paid subscribers can message me directly there. If you choose to support the show that way, you can send me your thoughts there, and I can share them here on the show. As always, thank you so much for listening. I will see you next week. Before you go, one quick idea. Think of someone you know who might be particularly interested in this episode. Click the share button and send this episode to that person, saying, I really think you should listen to this episode. In this era in which people are so overwhelmed with content from the moment they get up to the moment they go to sleep, getting a note from someone they know saying, I think you specifically would find this interesting, that is often the most impactful thing to help people discover this show. Thank you.